The tongue is a muscular hydrostat that forms part of the floor of the oral cavity. The left and right sides of the tongue are separated by a vertical section of fibrous tissue known as the lingual septum. This division is along the length of the tongue save for the very back of the pharyngeal part and is visible as a groove called the median sulcus. The human tongue is divided into anterior and posterior parts by the terminal sulcus, which is a V-shaped groove. The apex of the terminal sulcus is marked by a blind foramen, the foramen cecum, which is a remnant of the median thyroid diverticulum in early embryonic development. The anterior oral part is the visible part situated at the front and makes up roughly 2/3 the length of the tongue. The posterior pharyngeal part is the part closest to the throat, roughly 1/3 of its length. These parts differ in terms of their embryological development and nerve supply. The anterior tongue is, at its apex, or tip, thin and narrow. It is directed forward against the lingual surfaces of the lower incisor teeth. The posterior part is, at its root, directed backward, and connected with the hyoid bone by the hyoglossi and genioglossi muscles and the hyoglossal membrane, with the epiglottis by 3 glossoepiglottic folds of mucous membrane, with the soft palate by the glossopalatine arches, and with the pharynx by the superior pharyngeal constrictor muscle and the mucous membrane. It also forms the anterior wall of the oropharynx. The average length of the human tongue from the oropharynx to the tip is 10 cm. The average weight of the human tongue from adult males is 70 grams and for adult females 60 grams. Citation needed. In phonetics and phonology, a distinction is made between the tip of the tongue and the blade, the portion just behind the tip. Sounds made with the tongue tip are said to be apical, while those made with the tongue blade are said to be laminal. The upper surface of the tongue is called the dorsum, and is divided by a groove into symmetrical halves by the median sulcus. The foramen cecum marks the end of this division, at about 2.5 cm from the root of the tongue, and the beginning of the terminal sulcus. The foramen cecum is also the point of attachment of the thyroglossal duct and is formed during the descent of the thyroid diverticulum in embryonic development. The terminal sulcus is a shallow groove that runs forward as a shallow groove in a V shape from the foramen cecum, forwards and outwards to the margins, borders, of the tongue. The terminal sulcus divides the tongue into a posterior pharyngeal part and an anterior oral part. The pharyngeal part is supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve and the oral part is supplied by the lingual nerve, a branch of the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve, for somatosensory perception, and by the chorda tympani, a branch of the facial nerve, for taste perception. Both parts of the tongue develop from different pharyngeal arches. The 8 muscles of the human tongue are classified as either intrinsic or extrinsic. The 4 intrinsic muscles act to change the shape of the tongue, and are not attached to any bone. The 4 extrinsic muscles act to change the position of the tongue, and are anchored to bone. The 4 extrinsic muscles originate from bone and extend to the tongue. They are the genioglossus, the hyoglossus, often including the chondroglossus, the styloglossus, and the palatoglossus. Their main functions are altering the tongue's position, allowing for protrusion, retraction, and side-to-side movement. The genioglossus arises from the mandible and protrudes the tongue. It is also known as the tongue's safety muscle, since it is the only muscle that propels the tongue forward. The hyoglossus arises from the hyoid bone and retracts and depresses the tongue. The chondroglossus is often included with this muscle. The styloglossus arises from the styloid process of the temporal bone and draws the sides of the tongue up to create a trough for swallowing. The palatoglossus arises from the palatine aponeurosis, and depresses the soft palate, moves the palatoglossal fold towards the midline, and elevates the back of the tongue during swallowing. Four paired intrinsic muscles of the tongue originate and insert within the tongue, running along its length. They are the superior longitudinal muscle, the inferior longitudinal muscle, the vertical muscle, and the transverse muscle. These muscles alter the shape of the tongue by lengthening and shortening it, curling and uncurling its apex and edges as in tongue rolling and flattening and rounding its surface. This provides shape and helps facilitate speech, swallowing, and eating. The superior longitudinal muscle runs along the upper surface of the tongue under the mucous membrane, and elevates, assists in retraction of, or deviates the tip of the tongue. It originates near the epiglottis, at the hyoid bone, from the median fibrous septum. The inferior longitudinal muscle lines the sides of the tongue, and is joined to the styloglossus muscle. The vertical muscle is located in the middle of the tongue, and joins the superior and inferior longitudinal muscles. The transverse muscle divides the tongue at the middle, and is attached to the mucous membranes that run along the sides. The tongue receives its blood supply primarily from the lingual artery, a branch of the external carotid artery. The lingual veins drain into the internal jugular vein. The floor of the mouth also receives its blood supply from the lingual artery. There is also a secondary blood supply to the tongue from the tonsillar branch of the facial artery and the ascending pharyngeal artery. An area in the neck sometimes called the Pirogov triangle is formed by the intermediate tendon of the digastric muscle, the posterior border of the mylohyoid muscle, and the hypoglossal nerve. The lingual artery is a good place to stop severe hemorrhage from the tongue. Innervation of the tongue consists of motor fibers, special sensory fibers for taste, and general sensory fibers for sensation. Motor supply for all intrinsic and extrinsic muscles of the tongue is supplied by efferent motor nerve fibers from the hypoglossal nerve, with the exception of the palatoglossus, which is innervated by the vagus nerve. Innervation of taste and sensation is different for the anterior and posterior part of the tongue because they are derived from different embryological structures, pharyngeal arch 1 and pharyngeal arches 3 and 4, respectively. Anterior 2/3 of tongue, anterior to the valate papillae. Taste, chorda tympani, branch of the facial nerve via special visceral afferent fibers. Sensation, lingual branch of the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve via general visceral afferent fibers. Posterior 1/3 of tongue. Taste and sensation, glossopharyngeal nerve via a mixture of special and general visceral afferent fibers. Base of tongue. The upper surface of the tongue is covered in masticatory mucosa, a type of oral mucosa which is of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Embedded in this are numerous papillae that house the taste buds and their taste receptors. The lingual papillae consist of filiform, fungiform, valate, and foliate papillae. And only the filiform papillae are not associated with any taste buds. The tongue can also divide itself in dorsal and ventral surface. The dorsal surface is a stratified squamous keratinized epithelium which is characterized by numerous mucosal projections called papillae. The lingual papillae covers the dorsal side of the tongue towards the front of the terminal groove. The ventral surface is stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium which is smooth,